This webinar was recorded for subrecipients of the Tennessee Strong Families Grant on September 17, 2025. Payton Womack, Implementation Specialist at SWORPS, was our subject matter expert presenter. The training was designed to help subrecipients select and curate impactful client stories, apply engaging storytelling formats, and leverage their data for program and organizational longevity. The slides and reference materials are posted on our webpage for your reference and review.
Welcome in, everybody. I hope that you're having a great afternoon, and I'm excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you today as we start to begin our session. I'm going to ask the day-old question, can everyone see my screen? Is that all good for everybody? Okay, we've got that one checked off. Welcome to today's training for data-driven narratives and how we're going to talk about showcasing your mission and not just those metrics. So by the end, you'll learn how we can combine family voice to really tell a rich story of what the work you all are doing. So this is our agenda for today, just so you have a map of what to expect. We'll start off by getting to know each other a little bit with some introductions. We'll also go over some learning objectives just to detail what we'll know by the end of this. And then we'll start to build this data mindset before we even get into making a narrative. How we think about data, how we feel about data is really essential, and making sure we're able to tell a story that really connects with folks. After we do that, we'll look at a 4-step process of how to do data-driven narratives. And at the end of this session, you'll also have a template that you can take home so you can immediately apply this information you learned today. And that does bring that into that research toolkit. I know that after trainings, there's a lot of information that happens and you go, okay, how do I apply that? So the things that we talk about today, you'll be able to have 2 key resources that you can immediately use afterwards. And then we'll open the floor to questions if we have time for that as well. And as Brooke mentioned, as you have thoughts, questions, anything comes up for you, feel free to unmute, put something in the chat, and Brooke will help me monitor the chat as well. So we are going to start with introduction. So in the chat, if you will put your name, your role, your location, and I don't know about anyone else, I'm getting excited for fall. It doesn't feel like fall yet, but your favorite fall activity that you were looking forward to. And while we're doing that, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Payton Womack. I'm a senior evaluator with SWORPS. I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I am originally from rural Middle Tennessee, a little place called Sparta, if anyone's familiar with that. And after graduating, I spent some time in Chicago evaluating some early childhood doula programs and home visiting programs. Also spent some time evaluating USDA grants and tobacco prevention as well. And my favorite fall activity is definitely going to be hiking out in the woods. Tennessee's got some really beautiful woods that I love to enjoy. So that is definitely one that I see. I'm trying to find the chat so we can see all the good stuff that's coming in. Brooke, do you see the chat? Where we got folks from?
So we have Laura from Foundation House, and now all of them are coming in at once, and I can't read them all. We have Sierra from Families Free Johnson City. We do have people from across the state. So we also have Karen from Catholic Charities East Tennessee, Dr. Webster, Catholic Charities Nashville. We have Sandy from Knoxville. She's with, I believe, Pregnancy Services Program Leader. We have Mandy. She's also from West Tennessee, Catholic Charities. We have Ann Pirtle. She's with Ridgeview. That's Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I think I missed some at the top too. Kiki Hall. She is also with Catholic Charities, West Tennessee. We have people from all over.
Awesome. That is excellent. Anyone's favorite fall activities? Is anything standing out to you, Brooke? Do we have a consensus?
It's awesome camping. I think Estella said that she liked camping. We had some hiking in here. Some good Tennessee. Pumpkin patch. Sarah said pumpkin patch. That's a good one.
That was a good one.
Love that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks for sharing, everybody, and for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself and your favorite fall activity. I am going to transition us into now our learning objectives for today. So this is really what I want you all to be able to walk away with today. So first, I really want you to be able, if someone asks you, why it's important to have a data-driven or data mindset with data-driven narratives. I want you to be able to describe that importance. And then I also want you to be able to apply this four-step storytelling process to interpret the program data that you all have in your house and your programs. I also want you to be able to combine numbers and family voice to really create a mission-driven narrative that's going to highlight that program impact, but also is going to show actionable insights. So now we're going to just start, like I mentioned, with really building a data mindset. How we move from pieces of data to really meaning. Data on its own, I don't know about you all, can really feel messy. It can feel overwhelming. And sometimes you're looking at just numbers on a spreadsheet and you're going, what does this even mean? But with the right mindset, we can kind of move from scattered pieces to really a story that matters and highlights the families and the programs behind that. So we're going to share in the chat again, just some words that come up for you when you think of the word data. So in the chat, if you'll just put a few words, maybe one word, maybe it's a feeling, maybe it's a thought, but what comes to mind when you think of the word data? And Brooke, as those come in, do you mind reading those a little bit?
Absolutely. We've got Excel sheets, numbers, outputs, information, informed decisions, stats, numbers and analysis, client statistics, tells the story, impact, facts, information, and blueprint, measuring, stats again.
Nice. I'm hearing some similar things. We're thinking numbers. You're in the same frame of mind as me. Excel sheets. We're thinking of stats as well. So we kind of all have that understanding of like data really is this, it's a number thing, it's stats. It's kind of, it tells us our impact, but when we kind of orient ourselves around it, it's really going to come back to those numbers. So today we're going to talk about our data mindset and how we can use our data mindset to really craft a story that matters. So I want to be honest with you, this is a picture of me and my son. He is 7 years old, and we are at this Lego bed. And before I kind of explain why I'm showing you this picture today, I want you to know that I've not always thought of myself as a data person. When I was little, I was actually told I didn't have a math brain. And really early on, I had decided that maybe numbers just weren't for me. And maybe that was for someone else. And maybe you felt that way too, that, you know, the data or numbers can be, it's someone else's job. It's not something that I'm equipped to do. But the truth is that data is just, it's more than numbers. And data is part of a storytelling process. So that means it's a creative process. And yes, it is an analytical process, but it has to be paired with that creative mindset in order to tell a story that really connects with folks. And when we treat it as like an analytical and a creative process, we can kind of move beyond just charts and spreadsheets and really get to that meaning part. And that's why we're kind of starting with that today and talking about that data mindset, because we want to really position ourselves as the creators of this story, that we kind of have the autonomy and the authority to really tell that story, and that it won't just happen through just reporting the numbers. It really does have to have this creative human element to it, so we can go beyond numbers and really tell stories that matter. And that really brings me to this picture of me and my son, Jude. Like I said, he is 7 years old and he really loves Legos. And because I love him, I have learned to love Legos too. But if you look at that picture of that Lego bin, that is at one of our used bookstores. And it is a giant bin with just a bunch of Legos just dumped into this thing. And my first reaction every time going over there with him is, this is so overwhelming. I get so confused about the steps it would take to actually take any of these pieces of Lego and build something even kind of interesting. And that is kind of how data can exactly feel for a lot of folks. Raw data, and I'm thinking of just numbers on a spreadsheet, numbers on, you know, any report that we have. It's kind of messy and it's scattered, and it doesn't really tell us much on its own when it's just sitting there. But just like Legos in a bin, we, the people who come into it, we're the ones who really shape it and give it meaning when we start to build with it. But building a story about data is a very active and messy process, and it kind of requires you to trust the process along the way. So in this training, we're not going to just like stare at the bins or the spreadsheets and get really overwhelmed. We're going to learn how we can like pick up these pieces, organize them, and then build them into something that really matters so you can show the story of your impact with families. So that kind of brings us into this data mindset analogy that I'm going to use with Legos. And then we'll get into our four-part process of how we do these narratives. So this is the evolution of how Legos work. I don't know if anyone else has a kid that's obsessed with Legos, but you start with raw data or just Legos by themselves. That raw data is going to come from those monthly reports you do. They're mostly going to look like numbers, but they're also going to include quotes and stories from families. If you have focus groups that you've done, or an open-ended response on a survey, or individual interviews, that is also going to be raw data as well. So it's those numbers, but it's also that family voice that we have to have too. And then after you have that, you're going to kind of start to sort and arrange your data by likeness. So if it's something like housing supports, maybe you put those all together and you start to kind of go through this pile where it's not just a pile of random things, but it has color and meaning. And then you'll go to presenting that visually so you can kind of see where is the demand the most in this category. And then at the very end, you're going to explain it with a story. But we're just going to start with the raw pieces because I know that's where we all start. So just like a pile of Legos again, this is kind of how we start. And in our program, raw data can look like this. It can look like rental assistance. So maybe that's telling you how many families got help with paying their rent. Maybe in this pile, that is all the blue pieces. Maybe we also have utilities paid. How many times did we support a family on keeping their lights on? Maybe that's all the pink. Maybe individual therapy, which is going to be the number of families connected to counseling. Maybe that is the orange here. And then we have maybe resume building, getting adults and folks ready for career readiness. Maybe that's all that kind of maroon color. And then we have stories and feedback from families. Maybe that's the black Legos. And they all just kind of sit there, all piled together. And as someone who has to come in with a creative and analytical lens, we have to kind of start to sort through them. So that's going to be our next step after this raw pieces. We're going to sort them. So you're going to take all that data that you had and you're just going to sort them into categories. At this point, maybe you've taken everything that's housing supports and you've grouped them all together in this yellow category. And maybe that could mean, again, that rental assistance. Maybe it's transitional housing. Maybe it's access to a safe house. You're going to do the same for financial supports. Emotional supports and educational supports. And when you put those in those categories, then you can go, okay, out of these categories, where am I seeing a very high demand? Where am I seeing a very low demand? And based on what type of question that you want to ask about the data, you get curious about one of those. So for our example, maybe we're really curious about housing supports. We see a really big demand there, and we want to tell a story about housing supports. So after we've kind of organized it from just a pile, now we've got categories, we're going to zoom in again. And this is where we're going to start taking those pieces and we're going to present it visually. But we're also going to choose one area of impact that we want to talk about because there's so many things that our programs do that it can be hard to kind of tell it all at once. So to tell a really good story, you really want to zoom on one area of impact and discuss that. So for this, and out of all that pile of Legos, remember we had a big old pile. Now we kind of put them into categories. Now we're breaking it down even more. Here we have those housing supports, and we're looking at it now from rental assistance, transitional housing, and that safe house or emergency house. So you would look at the numbers of that, but you'd also can pair that with family voice. You might look at it and, totals just to kind of see what's happening. And you can see here, and just like this example visual, is that we have, rental assistance really high, and then transitional and safe houses come after that. But when we take that data and we sort it and then we present it visually, we've kind of gone through that creative and analytical process already of going, okay, we started with a big pile, then we went to categories, and now we're looking at it visually. So this is getting us an idea of how we're starting to build that mindset of you have to be an active participant and kind of getting your data in a place where you can really tell that story. So we've chosen that housing supports. The last step that you do with this kind of data mindset to move through this process is you have the numbers, but you're also going to explain it with a story. So that took that big pile of Legos, and now we have something here. And you can see in this picture, it kind of is a environment. It's a story. It kind of invites you in, and you can assign meaning to it. And my kind of understanding of how it works is the bricks of this are kind of the numbers, and then the stories from families are the windows and the things in the lawn and the flowers, because that really kind of brings the meaning into it. So you could say something like, we provided 128 families with housing supports this year, but that won't tell enough of the story. So you would want to bring in family voice, which would be those windows. It would be the flowers, all those different things. So you say 128 families we helped this year, and one parent told us, this really helped us from being evicted from our house. So pairing those two things together kind of create this full story of what happened for the program, but also what happened for the family. And again, when we combine, the numbers with that real story, it's like building the house that you see here again. The numbers are the bricks, they're solid, they have to be there. But the stories are those windows, the roofs, all the things that kind of bring it meaning. So together, they really complete that full picture so people can understand what your data means for them. And again, this is kind of the mindset. I want you to know it's normal to kind of feel very confused with data at the beginning because it does start with just a pile. And the really important thing about working with data is that that confusion is kind of a rite of passage because we're learning. So sorting through it, feeling a little bit lost at first, that is a part of that process of making sense for it. And as we move through that process, we can kind of see how those pieces start to come together. Again, first we kind of collect that raw data, those individual blocks that we have that represent things like housing supports, financial help, or therapy sessions. And next, you're going to really sort them and arrange them so they make more sense. It's not a pile anymore. And then you're going to want to start to see the patterns across. So that's why we build it visually. So we can kind of see what's being used most, where families' needs are most. And finally, after we've kind of went through that process of building through the data, you want to turn those blocks into a story or into a house. So families that receive these services, why did it matter? What was the outcome in the very end? And really, the whole point of that kind of data mindset is data alone in the pieces is not enough to really tell that story of impact. And it's a process in which you have to be an active participant to not be only analytical, but creative and kind of pair that data with a human element so you can really show that impact. So I want us to keep that mindset when we go through this four-step process, because that's exactly what we'll do here. But we've talked about that, building a data mindset. So we'll move into this part now. And these steps are really going to help us again kind of build that process of this is the data, this is kind of what it means, and this is what you should do about it. And there are four steps to this. So it's going to be what, here's what, so what, and now what. And this is a process and a templated thing that you'll get at the very end too, so you can apply it to yours. But I will jump into what each one means and how you can use it. So what we have here is our data storytelling guide. So this is how we're going to do it. Again, we're active participants in this. We have to kind of build this story along. And the what is going to be a really good question. We have to begin with a really good question about our families in which our data can answer. The here's what is the observe stage. You're going to take on your observational hat And you're just going to state and share the facts from the data without any interpretation or anything like that. Just putting down exactly what you see in front of you. The next stage is going to be so what? That's when you're going to infer and kind of take this process into more meaning. So you might draw inferences from the facts and identify what that suggests about the family's experience. As practitioners in the field, you can make a lot of observations and meaning as you're the folks working closest with the families. And you're going to highlight what these numbers and these family voices reveal together about a family's experience in the program. And then you're going to move into a now what? And this is going to be an act stage. So we have this data. Why does it matter? What should we do next from it? So this will kind of move us through that process of how to take just data to insight. And we're going to begin through this process with the what. So that is our question. And we're going to, again, begin with a really strong question. We want to be specific to one program area or one program activity and tell the story of that program activity. And you want to make sure your question is open-ended. So it's going to be more than a yes or no or a number question. And it's going to ask, how or in what ways. Let me go back. Or how and what ways. The reason we want to ask it in that way is because if you ask a question of how many families receive services, that is going to be a number and it's going to end there. But if you ask in what ways did housing support family stability, that is waiting for you to be able to tell that full story. So you have to ask a really strong question first. And these are some examples of how to take what we call a close-ended question, which is going to be answered in numbers or yes and no, to an open-ended question. So a closed question is going to ask, how many housing services did the program provide? Again, that's going to kind of end up in one situation where you're just providing a number. A way that you can make that more open-ended and ready for a data-driven narrative is to say something like, in what ways do housing supports influence family stability and well-being? That allows room for you to be able to tell that full story, and it's also focused on the family and their outcomes. Another example is how many financial services did the program provide? Again, it's kind of a one answer and then you're done. But a way that you can make that more open-ended is saying, in what ways does financial assistance impact family stability and ability to meet their essential needs, which is really telling that full story of that family and their experience in the program. Here we have the anatomy of a strong question. So how do you write a strong question? And you really want to start with an open-ended phrase. So here in the blue, we have in what ways. Again, that's just going to invite more than a yes or no or a number. And then after you have that, you want to really go into connecting it directly to the program area that you're wanting to explore. For our example today, we'll use housing supports. So in what ways do housing supports influence a family's stability and well-being? And that brings us to that last part that's in the purple color. And that's going to be bringing that question back to focus on family outcomes. So the family focus here is going to be beyond just receiving housing supports. How did that impact a certain area of their life, specifically their stability or their well-being? Again, it centers on that family impact and not just the numbers that were provided there. And when you put that all together, you really get a question, again, that goes beyond those metrics and points us towards a real meaningful answer that we could answer through our data. And so that next part of the storytelling, we've kind of made our question. So we're looking at in what ways do housing supports influence a family's stability and well-being. You're going to go to the here's what stage, and this is when you're going to get your spreadsheets out, any data that you have, and you're really going to observe. At this point, you should kind of just say the numbers, and that's all you have to do at this stage. And you really can summarize it in totals or averages. You can also not just the numbers that you have, but any family quotes that you have from focus groups, interviews, or open-ended questions. This is the time where you can take it and you look at it. For me personally, if I'm looking at a certain area, I will just take that data and put it on a Word document by itself, and I'll just have it there to look at it, just so I can get a full picture of kind of what's happening. And the reason we do a here's what and we just observe and tell the facts is that it helps us just observe what's happening and the patterns before we jump to any conclusions. Because we might think we know what's happening in a program, but looking at that data, we'll be able to say this is what has happened so far.
Hey, Peyton, I wanted to ask a question really quick.
Before
Do you think that it's more important to start with like qualitative or quantitative data when you're looking at that initial piece? Does that like, because I think sometimes if we're looking at the more qualitative data, like, a family voice, could that cause you to jump to a conclusion too quickly?
That's a great question. I think that in my experience, I kind of look at them in tandem. So I will take specifically like the example we have here of families who received housing supports, and I would put them side by side and to see what they're telling collectively. I think if we look at them all in isolation, they just don't complement each other enough. It could lean one certain way or another. But I think when you kind of combine them together in tandem, that's kind of when you get that full story. So definitely, I think the more traditional path is to always kind of start with our numbers because again, they're kind of our bricks. They are absolutely essential and we have to have them. But when they stand alone by themselves, they don't tell that full story. So yeah, that's a great question, Brooke. And then we have here is our here's what. Again, that's kind of where you're observing and you're putting on that observational cap. All you're doing at this point, and like I said, my personal method is just to dump it into a Word document, or if you have your Excel sheet, it can be a tab there, just to see what's happening. So here we have in total, and this is all an example data and mock data, we had 128 families who received housing supports, 80 had rental assistance, 25 had transitional housing, and 23 had safe houses. And those are just the numbers alone that we have there. But when we add that family voice, we'll also like kind of read through that. You put that to the side too. So these would be quotes from families that are relevant to housing supports too. So some of the family voice says the rent helped us from being kicked out. It gave me time to catch up. Staying in transitional housing gave us a safe place while I looked for work. The shelter was the only option when things got bad at home. I don't know what I would have done without it. Again, at this stage, you're just putting it all on a sheet of paper just so you can see it together. And that kind of leads us into our so what. So at this point, what we've done is asked a really good question, really specific to one program area. And then we have also just stated the facts of what that is. So we've looked at that quantitative data and we looked at that qualitative data. And then we're going to come in and we're going to say, okay, so what? Why does that matter? What does that tell us altogether? So this is the stage where you're going to infer based off of patterns that you've seen in your field, based off of experience of working with participants, based off of best practice that you've seen as well. And you can also bring in other data sources if you need to. But the real big question at this stage is what conclusions or inferences might you draw from the facts that you've seen? So what does it really tell us? We might see, that those housing supports aren't just keeping a roof over their head. That is true and factual, but it's also influencing family stability. It's also influencing stress and also long-term well-being as well. So again, this stuff kind of helps us move from facts to insight. And it's where those numbers and stories come together, that quantitative, which are the numbers, and the qualitative, which are quotes and stories from family, come together to really highlight an actual pattern and binding. Again, so that's going to suggest an experience that that family is having. So this is kind of where everything comes together. So this is our so what, and this is kind of when we're doing our narratives all together. And I kind of see it as numbers, voice, meaning. And that's kind of the formula that we have here when you're sharing this information. You're going to do a here's what, and you're going to start with just the numbers. because again, those are our building blocks in which that we really have to have in order to tell a really credible story. So here we have this year, 128 families received housing supports through our program. 80 received rental assistance, 25 found stability in transitional housing, and 23 turned to safe houses during crisis. So just laying the foundation of what our program has done this year. And then you're going to do a here's what again. And this time we're going to have that qualitative data. Remember, that's our windows, that's our roof, that's our flowers, that's adding more of this like human element that we really need to be able to connect with a story and remind folks that, these are not just numbers, these are families. So we want to really ground them again in that experience. So after you say the numbers, you want to say something like, behind every number is a story. So remind them of this human element that we're experiencing. And you can do that in a couple of ways. The first way that I have here is sharing a direct quote from my family, which I can be really powerful and kind of exemplifying the impact of that. So here I have one parent shared, the rent really helped us from being kicked out. That's huge. And if you can't share a direct quote, you can more so summarize what was said by other folks. So for others, transitional housing gave them time to find work, and safe houses provided protection when home was not a safe option. So again, you're giving those numbers, and then you're also saying, beyond the numbers, here's also what the family is saying about their experience. And then we just covered that. Now what? What does it mean? This is where you'll kind of jump in and be that analytical and creative person to come in and say, why do I think that this matters and what does it tell people? Because you all closest to the field kind of know how that impacts people beyond just a roof over their heads, but really laying that out in a way that people can understand and it's accessible is really important. So here we have families in our community face real challenging with housing stability. You see that in your data that is something that is a high need in your program. Based off of your quotes that you have here, the supports didn't just provide shelter. Of course they did, but they also prevented evictions. They also offered safety, and they gave families the stability to really begin to rebuild their lives. So it kind of goes back to that larger picture of, yes, it was housing supports, but without housing supports, there could have been an eviction. Without housing supports, they wouldn't have had that time to find a job. So that really impacts their long-term well-being. So when you have that all together, that's also a very bite-sized way for someone to understand this one element of your program. And you could repeat this process with other places in your program. So what would it look like to do a what, here's what, so what, now what with financial supports? What would it look like to do that for therapy and counseling, to go through that process and really lay it out for them of here's what our numbers are saying. Here's what our families are saying. And here, as practitioners, what we think why this matters and why you should care about that. So, kind of going in that sequential order really sets up that foundation to tell that story succinctly in a really powerful way as well. And then we have this category, which is going to be now what? Now, this one can be done. So it depends on how you want to do it. But you could tag a now what kind of at that end of that paragraph, especially if you're sending this to someone who you're wanting to have more funding or anything like that. You say, well, we have housing supports. It's a major need. This is what we think should be done with it. It can also be used internally for your program to allocate resources, to improve services. But we always want to make sure that the data that we have, that we are doing something with it. So this question really asks, what internal and external action steps will the program take because of what we learned? So again, that's what you're deciding what should happen because of these stories and the data that emerged. It's again going to turn it into action for the families in the program. And it's going to again help us move from insight to impact as well. And these are some of the examples of how we see this happening. Again, you can use this internally. And what it would look like to use data internally is going to, maybe readjust or improve how services are delivered. Maybe we train staff or volunteers based on what the data shows. We update our policies, our forms, or our tracking tools to really capture better information. Or maybe we add some reflection time so staff can learn from this data in the family voice and sit down and really get to that so what stage. Like your staff come together, they look at the numbers and they look at the family voice, and together as a program, you all say, why does this matter? So you can kind of really tell that story. You might reallocate sources towards, biggest needs. If you're seeing a high demand in this, how do we meet the needs of families? Externally with partners and community members, you might share those findings with community partners and funders and policymakers to advocate for your program. You might use this data to build or strengthen partnerships to address gaps. So if you're coming with a new partner to say, last year, this is what we provided to families. 128 families received this housing support, and it really helped their stability and their long-term well-being by preventing evictions, by providing enough time for them to find another job. So this is how we holistically kind of supported that family through this one area. It also helps raise awareness in your community about family needs. If you're noticing, housing supports is a large need, and it's not something that you have to kind of branch out and maybe partner with someone else. How can you kind of put a full wrap around that family as well? It'll also, again, advocate for new or expanded resources. So when we see those high demands and we want to be able to better meet them, having that data from the numbers and then the stories from the family really create a strong foundation to advocate for that. It also, again, helps you work with other organizations to coordinate those services more effectively so you're able to share those findings and really communicate what your program's able to do and the return of that for families as well. So data in the end is supposed to help us create clarity about the work that we do and help guide other folks in partnering with us and help us guide us internally of how we can kind of improve our own practice and what we do as well. And that kind of brings us into this resource toolkit. I do want to go over it with you all because I want you to be able to use it and practice it as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second while I transition to that. And I think Brooke is also going to put it in the chat so you all can access it as well. So let me grab that for you. So what we have here is the data storytelling guide using that what, here's what, so what, now what process. Again, we have kind of the layout here. Again, it's going to start with that really strong question that's going to be open-ended and focused on, one specific program area. Then you're going to go into the here's what, you're going to observe, put that observational cap on, and you're going to just state the facts. And again, those facts are numbers and they're also the stories too. And then you're going to go into that so what? So you're going to draw some inferences by looking at those facts. And as a practitioner, what does that mean about families' experiences? And why should it matter to other people who are learning about this? And then you're going to do a now what? Again, that's going to act on the insight that was identified by the program. So how this template works is it kind of walks you through that whole process. So before you begin, you're going to need to identify what data sources you have. Maybe you just have numbers. Maybe you just have a monthly report or quarterly report, and you don't have any qualitative data, any of those survey or open-ended responses or interviews with families. So you're just going to start by listing what you have. So you would, put the first one, and that'll also help you understand, okay, we're missing maybe a family voice here. How can we do some interviews with families to kind of really strengthen our understanding of this data? So that's something you'll do before you begin, just to make sure you're prepared. And then step one, again, you're going to start with that question. Here in the template, it kind of shows you the things that you should really remember to focus on here. So making sure it's specific to one program area, making sure it's open-ended, ask, a larger yes or no. Instead, it's more of a how and in what ways. And it's focused on those family outcomes. So you could write your question here. And then after you write your question, you'll go and grab your data. And like I had mentioned before, how I just dump my data, I might dump some summaries here. So if I'm looking at those housing supports, I might just dump what I have there, just in this information. If I have quotes about from families about housing supports, I would put all that information there. And then you're just going to spend some time observing what you see. The number section is right here. And then family quotes and stories are right here. So you can kind of see those working in tandem. And then that step three, again, is that so what process. So you're going to break down your interpretation into those three parts that we saw in the PowerPoint. So I call it numbers, family, voice, meaning. That's kind of the formula. Numbers, family, voice, meaning. So you're going to summarize the totals or summarize the numbers either as totals, averages, or counts, whatever makes sense for the type of data that you have. And you'll put that all there. Then you're going to summarize the family voice. So again, that can look like pulling a direct quote. It can look like summarizing or paraphrasing what families are saying about these services, and you'll put those there. And then at the end, you will infer that meaning. So what do those numbers and voices mean altogether? That's where you're going to jump in as that practitioner and come in with that experience in the field to say beyond just what we provided, how did it influence and impact a family's ability and well-being and overall. And then you'll take all those different parts and you'll put them right here, and you will have a three-part narrative to kind of go down. That starts with those numbers, that family voice, and then the meaning as well. And then we have our now what, which is that final step. And you want to think about, based off of what we know, what are some internal actions that we could take as a program to make sure that we're making decisions aligned with family needs and the patterns that we see? And then external actions. Are we going to send this to a community partner? Are we going to share this as a social media post? Are we going to put this in our annual report? Where are we going to share this data so it's not just sitting with us? Because that data is most useful when it's shared with others to really communicate the story of your program and the stories of families as well. So that is how that one works. And I wanted to stop sharing again so I can pull up this other one. And then I think we'll also have time for questions. The next part that I have is I don't know how much qualitative data you all have. So I wanted to just put some questions together that would provide you some ideas of what you could ask families in order to collect those stories and those real examples of how families engage with the program. So they kind of have categories here. And again, you could do this in, interviews with families, just that could be an individual interview. It could also be a survey question at the end of a survey, and it's just open-ended. It could also be in focus groups. So depending on your capacity, what you're able to do, you could use these questions in a slew of different ways. But again, they also are categorized by specific program areas, because the more we kind of focus on one area, the more succinct story we can tell. We do have some just like general questions that you can always ask too, just trying to get an understanding of how accessible the program is. But these are also the categorical type stories. So when we look at material and financial assistance, asking families to share a time when support like food, supplies, or a bill made a difference in their family. So they could tell you in a few words how that made a difference. And that's again going to kind of really support those numbers and telling that full story. We have housing supports, which we kind of covered here. But how did housing supports like rental help or shelter, how did that affect your family? Really inviting them to tell a full story there. We have information and referrals. So what kind of connections or referrals to other services did you receive here? And how did those referrals help you and your family? So being sure to kind of keep those open-ended questions so they can tell that full story there. We have some questions for emotional support. So what has it been like to receive emotional support, like counseling and support groups, education and workforce? So what types of new skills or knowledge have you learned because of the program? Not just I received, support with education or resume, but how did it make a difference in the end? And then we have advocacy and report. So, asking questions also about thinking about hope in the future, like what has given you hope? What do you look forward to now is really helpful too in telling that full story. And then some closing reflections as well. So those are two resources that we have. that will allow you to really apply this information immediately after our session today. And they're meant to be really accessible and kind of begin the story of building um, your own data-driven narrative. As you kind of do that template and go throughout, you then might want to think about, oh, how can I connect another category to this to tell even a larger story? So you kind of want to start small with one category and then let yourself kind of build overall. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I do want to open the floor to questions or turn it back to Brooke, who can kind of tell us where we can get all these resources.
Hi. Thank you so much, Payton, for a great presentation. I just had a quick question. Um, and throughout all of our programs, we do surveys, of course, to get feedback and stuff. In your experience, and I know every client community is different, is it better to give people a longer survey, or is it better to give them potentially two shorter surveys if we have the capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it, always kind of depends on the folks that you're working with. I have found if you are going to give a longer someday survey, sometimes having an incentive to do that. I know in the past, sometimes we couldn't compensate each person. Kind of having it in one setting is really helpful because it will also capture like one moment in time versus if you kind of do two separate surveys, you'd have to make sure that they're kind of following each other and within that same timeline. But there's also ways that you can kind of make sure a survey is not just like so visually overwhelming by creating kind of those matrix questions where you have like the disagree, agree at the top and your questions down here. So they're not scrolling through pages and pages of it, and it kind of becomes a little bit more of a kind of click and read. But I would probably recommend just one larger survey when possible, just to make sure you're kind of being really succinct. And when you took that data and the timeline, and then whenever possible, any types of, incentives, even a drawing can really drive up participation. Also, you can kind of estimate in the about section, which I recommend providing, of how long it should typically take. I was talking to my director the other day, and he said it takes about 1 minute to answer about 6 or 7 close-ended questions, so multiple choice. So that's one way that you can kind of measure that and help folks anticipate how long it would take. And if it comes from, someone they know versus like just like a organization, I think they're also more likely to complete that survey too.
I also did want to mention we are going to offer, we can call it like small group coaching or small group training too. If there's something like that, Estella, that you want Peyton to look at your um, survey or something and say, what's the best way to visually represent this? Like, we want to be able to host that for you all and facilitate that. If that's something that you all are interested in, you can email our help desk. I'll put a reminder about it in the email this afternoon. But or maybe you have your data and you have your story, but you want Peyton to look at it and say, how do we need to represent this visually? What makes this make sense? Anything like that, that you're like, hey, I really want to tell this story, but I don't know how. I don't know how it looks best. I really want to make it make sense or make it look nice to present to your funders or the FAU or, whoever. We'd like to be able to offer that for you all. So we're happy to set up that and facilitate that with Peyton.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to kind of look at your data with you and we could walk through that again because learning it is one thing and then you have to practice it and kind of go through that over and over again. So I'd love to do, any facilitated practice session with you where you bring your data, you bring your quotes, and we kind of do it together so we can kind of build that muscle for telling those narratives. That's a great point, Brooke.
To those. But thank you again so much, Peyton, for this awesome presentation, for making it make sense, and for challenging us to be creative and analytic with data and not just get stuck on the numbers. We really appreciate it. And with 1 minute to spare, Chase has just dropped those documents in the chat too. So like I said, those will be on the web page and I'll send them to you as well. But if you want to go ahead and click on them, we'll keep the Zoom open for a second so that you all can have access to them now. And if anybody has any other questions, just let us know. We're here, data related or not, just email our help desk or give us a call. We're always happy to help. We hope that you all have a great afternoon, and we will see you next time.